Welcome to Where Parents Talk. My name is Lianne Castelino. Our guest today is a social worker, speaker, and author. Don Ryan is a former therapist. He currently works on violence reduction and suicide prevention. He has lost 3 family members to suicide, including the most recent, a brother, in 2022. Don's first book, a self-help styled memoir, is called The Secret Struggle: Surviving the Suicide of a Loved One. He is also a father of 2 teenagers, and he joins us today from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Thank you so much for taking the time.
It's my pleasure. I really appreciate your asking me to join you this afternoon, Lianne.
Well, a painful topic, a difficult topic, but certainly a necessary topic to talk about, especially in the world that we live in today. In what ways, Don, would you say that your personal, your lived experience, your professional experience as well with loss, specifically with suicide, has marked you?
It- for me personally, this is the most important question that you might ask me because it's had such a significant impact on my life. I know the honest answer is that I would be a very different person today without those experiences. I know that I would be a much healthier person over the last 30 years had I not experienced them. But
Take,
in a very odd way, it also made me who I am.
yeah.
I wouldn't have developed the professional career that I have today without those childhood experiences that I went through. I wouldn't have written this book without experiencing those losses through suicide. What I've heard from others is that sharing my experiences has had somewhat of a positive impact on others, and that's all that matters to me. I expected to hear very positive things from my family and friends. They love me. But when I hear from people who I'll never meet, who tell me that they feel seen and heard and they feel less alone, I know that the experiences that I went through helped me to make that connection. And that's all that matters to me.
Let's unpack some of those experiences, Don. What do you wish that what you know now, that you had known back 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago, in fact, when you experienced suicide for the first time with the loss of your dad while you were a senior in college? What do you wish you had known back then?
Overwhelmingly, I wish that I knew that it wasn't my fault. I had such significant guilt being a part of this suicide story. And that guilt really turned to shame very quickly. Those feelings, coupled with my family's Irish culture of not wanting to talk about negative things outside the family, and even things that were taboo, like alcoholism and mental health, we weren't even allowed to talk about it amongst ourselves. So this led to me completely shutting down. I shoved all those feelings of guilt because I thought it was my fault down so deep, and it affected me in a dramatic way.
Can you take us through what you recall of that time in terms of how you dealt with your dad taking his own life?
I do think it's important, Leanne, to start about talking about family. I just described our Irish culture and who we are as kids, but the other part of the story is that we lived in a house that looked very positive from the outside. And both of my parents struggling with alcoholism, it wasn't always that way. My father left our home when I was about 9 or 10 years old. And I'm no different than most other kids that didn't have a father figure growing up. You always hope that you have that father figure. And he would literally show up every 6 months and spend some prescribed time with us. And as a young man, I was really resentful about all of that. Once I got away to college and I saw healthy relationships and a positive future, I was able to let go of all of that. And that was a good thing for me. Literally, the first opportunity that I had to confront my father on the absence in my life was over my college graduation. My mother, who doesn't ask for much, asked me not to have my father attend that graduation ceremony. And I saw that as an opportunity for me to tell him that it wasn't just that mom helped me through school, but that she had been there through my childhood. And this time was really for her. Because I didn't want to hurt him, I didn't bring up examples, I didn't rub it in, but it was really clear this was the reason I didn't want him to attend the college graduation ceremony. And he chose to die within 2 hours after that conversation. The guilt that I experienced at that time, it was really indescribable. I mean, it started with questions of how could I have done that to him and how can anybody do that, right? I went through all the logic models in my head, and intellectually, I could tell you that there had to be numerous other contributors to his suicide. He was a veteran of the US Army and he was in the Korean War. And of course, we know the veterans experience a lot of PTSD. Maybe he was depressed all of his life, like my youngest brother, Brendan, was. There had to be tons of contributors to him looking to alcohol as a way to cope with some of his issues. But these intellectual messages that I could rationalize in my head, they don't always correlate to our heart. And all I could hear was, if I didn't have that conversation with him at that moment, he wouldn't have died that day. If he waited a week, if he left a note and explained something, it probably would not have had the impact that it had on my life. So I literally shoved all those feelings down for, it's going to sound dramatic when I say it, but 20, 25 years. And I probably talked about the truth of what happened to about 10 people during that period of time. I think this describes best in how that secrecy was in this wonderfully imperfect family that I have. Before the book came out, I had to reach out to 6 first cousins to let them know that their uncle died of suicide. And only 2 of them knew that he did because their parents told them. So this is a thing that is difficult for families to talk about, and part of the reason that I wanted to write this book.
Thank you for sharing that story, Dawn. And it strikes me as you recount it that, it takes a lot of courage to continue to go on as you did. What do you think got you through that time?
Ignorance, maybe. I mean, during that time, I just plugged along. I went back to, I have to do this and I have to do this. It led to me not sleeping well. It led to probably not the most healthy relationships sometimes, but it was the only way that I could really get through it until I was able to deal with it in therapy. I was very lucky as I was going through a divorce 6 or 7 years ago that I had a therapist who was apt enough to see through some of my hidings and got me to talk about some family of origin issues and got me to talk about my father's suicide. And she really helped me a great deal, really change me into becoming a much healthier person.
So you go through this experience in the late 80s, and then in 2013, you lose a cousin who had schizophrenia to suicide. How were your coping mechanisms different this time around than they were the first time that you experienced it?
And Vinny's death was very different. First of all, he and I were very close. He was the godfather to my oldest son, Johnny. I just had a great relationship. I loved that kid so much. And that was the experience where I had the most amount of grief in losing someone. So it was very different than the situation with my father. What happened with Vinny developing schizophrenia, it was apparent that he wasn't healthy. It's an awful disease that destroys relationships with paranoid thinking and really odd behaviors. And Vinny went from this very social uh, kid with a lot of friends and a high school and college athlete to being 21 to 25 years old and becoming a very different person. At age 26, he finally succumbed to these intrusive voices in his head and he died. But it was different because people talked about what happened. They were more open about it and it was more accepting. And as a result, Vinny's parents and his siblings got a lot more support than my siblings got after my father's death.
Fast forward a few years ahead of time here now to 2022. And incredibly, you go through this and your family goes through this for a third time when your brother takes his own life in 2022. What did that look like in the aftermath for you?
Yeah, Leanne, this was truly the straw that broke the camel's back for me. Uh, I do think that if I hadn't addressed some of these issues in therapy before Brendan's death, 2022 would have been a much harder year for me. Of course, I asked all the questions that many of us ask. Why didn't he reach out to us when he had so many people supporting him? He had friends, he had family, he had a fiance and was looking forward to get married. None of it made sense to anybody, but it was the third suicide in our immediate family that really made this a much more complicated issue for us. And I was really angry about it. I mean, we have a genuinely loving family with really good people in it. And I just kept looking and saying, why is my family going through so much heartache? And they don't deserve it. It was difficult. So that was the thing that was most difficult about Brendan's death.
All along the way, Don, the other thing that's so striking is that you actually worked in this space. The lived experience is one thing, but you also were a social worker working, in child welfare, working with homeless, working in terms of suicide prevention. A lot of people might say to themselves, this has been so painful, really unprecedented in many ways. I don't know a lot of families that have that experience, but you also pursued it as your profession. Was that an advantage or a disadvantage for you in terms of how you coped with each of these deaths?
I I think they go hand in hand. On the one From the one perspective, I have learned so much from working with families and individuals over these 30 years who've struggled in whatever was happening in their life and many times considered whether or not they wanted to continue to live. Whether it was they didn't know if they had value in the world because of their mental health issue or their substance abuse issue, or they were dealing with trauma from a sexual assault or a childhood experience or domestic violence, whatever it is, I was able to learn a lot from working with these really resilient people. At the same time, I was also successful because I think that I was able to put myself in their shoes. I was able to have true empathy because I understood some of the feelings that they were having, some of the experience that they were going through. So I think they played off each other. And the result is I've been able to, I hope, do some good work over the years.
So take us through then, Don. What was the impetus for the secret struggle after you had gone through all of this in your life over decades? You decide to write a book about it. Why?
Well, I certainly couldn't have done it in the year after Brendan's death. 2022 was so difficult for me, but I was such a mess in that year that when the year ended, I came to the conclusion that I had to do something tangible for other people that were going through the same thing. I was having panic attacks at work. I couldn't concentrate. There were times where I felt like I lost 20 IQ points. I just couldn't think at times. It definitely affected my relationships in my personal life. I questioned a lot of what was happening in the world. I isolated myself during that year, and I knew that there were other people who were feeling alone in the same way. So the book itself started as the subtitle is focused on supporting those people who have lost a loved one to suicide. I wanted to be open about grief and that people go through grief in very different ways, and there's no timeline for grief. I wanted to talk about the guilt and shame because I experienced it, but I also know lots of other people experience it. I wanted people to know that it was okay to be angry with that person who chose to die by suicide. And this is a really hard thing for people to talk about, but the emotion of relief is really difficult for people as well. Having somebody with a mental health issue or substance abuse issues and their daily behaviors can be really difficult. And when that is gone, there is this feeling of relief that they don't have to deal with the uncertainty and the violence that sometimes happens in their family homes. And that can be a really difficult thing for people to deal with. So I wanted to address all of those issues and let people know that they're not alone. And if a dope like me can get through this, then they can do the same thing. But as I was writing it, I also knew that I had to focus on prevention. And one of the things that I saw was a huge issue was this social stigma of mental health and suicide in our society. And my belief that it contributes to this rising number of suicide incidents worldwide.
Let's dig into that a little bit in terms of, I think you can agree we have come a long way in terms of discussing suicide. Where we are today is light years different than, in each of the experiences that you had at the times you had them. What is your assessment of where we are on this discourse in society, and where do you believe we need to go next?
Yeah, we could talk about this for an hour. So I will try to be concise, but I think this is a really important question because there's so many aspects to this. The first is there's this premise of mental health, and it has led to a fear of mental health. We can't have that fear because if we have that fear, then people aren't going to be able to have those conversations to get the help for people they love. We also know that not all suicides are a result of mental health. We have people who may have made a life-changing mistake and they don't want to admit to it to their family, or they don't want to face a long prison sentence, right? These are real examples that don't just happen to people who are depressed, right? But there's this stigma that people who die by suicide are too weak to handle these things in life. And it bleeds into other aspects of society. We see social stigmas in religion, for example. Now, it's gotten much better in the last generation, for sure, where we have younger clergy who see suicide in a different way. But the five most popular religions in the world still look at it as a sin, still talk about whether or not, if you believe in heaven, people will go to heaven. And these are things that affect those of us who are left behind, thinking about what's going to happen with that person. I also know that there are stigmas regarding gender that are really significant that we have to talk more about. 80% of all suicides are men. 80%. That is dramatic. We could have a conversation just on this on its own too. And there's lots of reasons why this might be, but I look at the socialization of boys and this encouragement for kids to not cry, boys not to cry and to be problem solvers, not to admit weaknesses. I think this leads directly to them becoming adults and not being able to admit that they need help, not to admit that they're struggling. Women do a much better job than men do. They will get help from their sister and their mother. They'll go to a doctor, they'll go to a therapist. And men shove all those feelings down and they don't feel like they can admit it. And as a result, we have statistics that show that depression is higher in women, even though that is absolutely not true. It's just they get help for it. And men have much higher rates of substance abuse because they use that to shut it down. Now, we're in this period in our history where we're addressing a lot of toxic masculinity, and that's needed. But I don't know that we're always looking at how we got to the place that we are and how these societal expectations of men to be stoic, as we see in so many heroes in the media and movies, are today. What I know is this: I've been in public service for more than 30 years. If there was any other demographic, it doesn't matter who it is, whether it's gender or sexual orientation or race, 80% of all suicides were that demographic other than men. There would be outrage, there would be focus, there would be conversations, there would be lots of money that would be dedicated to changing this. And I think we as a society need to get away from this socialization of men to be strong and not talk about their feelings and not admit that they need help, because it's just going to continue if we don't.
So, along those lines, Don, as a father of two teenage boys
Mm.
yourself, having lived through all the things that we just talked about, what is your approach with your two sons? And you've also got the professional experience as well. When it comes to communicating with them, when it comes to discussing emotions with them as well.
This is just my message to my kids, but my message is that they can always come home when there's going to be a problem. Life is hard, and there's always going to be a difficulty in life down the road. And I want them to know that if a relationship fails, if they lose a job, if they make a mistake in life, they can always come back to family. They can always come to me, to their mother, and we're not going to judge them. I also tell both of my sons that the relationship between each of them is more important than the relationship with me. I'm only going to be with them for 40 or 50 years. I hope that both of them are together for 80 plus years. The message that I want to give is that they always have someone to go back to, and you have to be open and honest and communicative when we have these problems, because that's what it's going to get us through these hard things in life.
You know, one of the things we try to do with the Where Parents Talk podcast is really present um, approaches to parents that are proactive in nature as opposed to being reactive. Is there anything you can offer parents listening to or watching this interview about how they can be proactive about communicating emotional health and well being of their children in advance of a potential issue arising?
I would suggest that we look at this fear-based perspective that we had when you and I were kids. If there was a death by suicide when we were kids, nobody talked about it. There was this worry that someone would think, I can do this too, that we're putting this idea of suicide into their heads, instead of addressing the issue and being open and talking about it. Even today, we have doctors, we have therapists that are seasoned and terrific, and they have a very difficult time talking about suicide. It is one of these taboo subjects. And the reason that we as parents don't know how to talk about it is that our parents and our grandparents never talked to us about it. And I think sometimes we have to say that our parents and our grandparents weren't perfect. They loved us and they were responding to how they were raised, but sometimes we have to make changes. And if we want our kids to be healthier than we were, we have to look at what's going to be best for them and what positive message they can get, even though it's hard for us to address it.
Don, I wonder if you could take us through a little bit of the approach and the process you undertook to write The Secret Struggle, having all the background you had, and then deciding to sit down and put it into a book form. What was your approach?
The first thing I'll say is I was doing it for myself also. I was hoping that it would be cathartic in some way, and it wasn't. It was very difficult to write. One of the things that I tried to do is when I take these short chapters, I think this is important to say too. I intentionally made the book concise. So it's only 154 pages. And I believe that people who are going through this kind of trauma of losing a child or a spouse or a best friend to suicide, we're not able to retain everything that's going to be in a book that's 325 pages long. So one of my goals when I was writing it, the process that I had was to try to make those chapters short, those subjects short, and I would address something. And then if I was able to use a personal example that someone might remember, I wanted to be able to do that. I wanted people to read something and then be able to put it down. And I didn't want I wanted them to be able to read the whole thing. Now that the book has been published and I'm getting feedback, I'm starting to feel a little of that catharsis because I am getting some of that feedback that I described before that was so important to me. But in writing the book, it was difficult. It took me a little longer than I thought that it would.
What would you like readers to take away from The Secret Struggle?
I think two things. One is, and I don't want to repeat myself because I talked about this feeling of being alone and isolating myself, but it's a really common feeling for a lot of people that are experiencing the death of somebody by suicide. I had two siblings who went through these deaths with me. And I still felt like nobody could understand what I was going through, even though I had two siblings that I was really close to who went through the same thing. The second thing that I want to offer is on the front of the book, there's only one symbol on the front of the book, and it's this Irish symbol of the tree of life. And this is not written in the book, but the reason I have that in there is I love the idea that the roots that are in the grounds that you can't see, that I see as our generations that came before us, they don't have to define the fruit that's going to come on those trees, those branches above them. And we have an opportunity to say, our parents and our grandparents didn't do anything wrong, but we can make things better and we can be healthier if we have that open communication to our kids, because if we can do it with our kids, we hope that our kids can do it with their kids a generation later.
Don, really briefly, because we're almost out of time, but I did want to ask you, what would you say that you have learned about yourself through everything you've lived through and now through the process of writing this book? What have you learned about yourself?
I have learned that I can't do it by myself. Whether it's addressing these personal issues that I had to resolve, I did a really poor job of shoving all those feelings down and trying to move on with life without addressing them. If I had talked to friends and family that I trusted and opened up, if I had gone to a therapist 25 years ago, I would be in a much different place. I also think professionally, we have the same obligation to know that not one person can do this, that this has to be a team effort by groups of people who collaborate. I think that the book has to be a catalyst for future conversations. We have to get out there and talk about this, because if we can talk about it, you don't have to agree with anything that I say. But if you leave this podcast interview, if you leave the book and you go to your best friend or your spouse or your sibling and you say, I want to talk about what I just heard, that's what matters. So my effort is to try to do as many presentations talking about this because I don't think that any book can stand alone. I do think it's a more powerful message when we're able to have the conversation. You remember things in a different way when you can hear someone talk about it. So I put together these 4 different presentations. That's my goal right now. I want to get out to as many people that will allow me to come and have the conversation with different groups of people at schools and communities and organizations to help their community be as healthy as possible.
Well, it certainly takes a lot of courage to go through what you've been through, to live to tell the tale, and certainly to be, have the desire to help others as well on a very difficult topic. Don Ryan, author of The Secret Struggle. We so appreciate your time and perspective today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate being here.